They called him Ibrahim the Mad, the Ottoman Sultan who lost his empire for an obsession with women. For 4 centuries, historians painted him as history's most depraved ruler, a man so consumed by lust that he drowned his entire harem of 280 concubines in a jealous rage. Hundreds of Ibrahim's personal letters, discovered in Topkapi Palace archives, reveal something impossible. These aren't the writings of a madman. They're rational, educated, strategic. Ibrahim expelled his own mother from politics. He refused to let women interfere in governance. He prayed for his people's happiness upon taking the throne. So why does every mainstream source insist he was insane? Because the men who murdered Ibrahim wrote the history books. They needed the world to believe he deserved death, so they created the perfect monster story. The evidence that could have saved his reputation was buried for centuries by his own executioners. What I found in those archives isn't just proof of Ibrahim's innocence, it's documentation of one of history's most successful character assassinations. The real question isn't whether Ibrahim was mad. It's how many other tyrants were actually victims of the systems that destroyed them. Subscribe to discover the evidence they never wanted you to see. But first, let me show you how Ibrahim's story ended, because understanding his final moments changes everything about how we interpret his life. August 18, 1648. Dawn breaks blood red over the Bosphorus as strangled screams echo through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace. The sound bounces off silk tapestries and gold-inlaid walls, a horrific symphony that penetrates every corner of the imperial residence. In a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, a 31-year-old man sits cross-legged on Persian carpets, wearing violet-pink robes that catch the early morning light. His name is Ibrahim I, and he rules an empire that stretches from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen. In his trembling hands, he holds the Quran, perhaps seeking comfort in verses he's memorized since childhood. Footsteps approach heavy boots against marble, the rustle of official robes, the whispered conversations of men about to commit regicide. When the executioners enter, even they hesitate. The chief executioner, a man named Kara Ali, whom court historians describe as having no ray of light in his face, actually tries to flee rather than strangle an Ottoman sultan. He's forced back by the Janissary commander, and as the silk bowstring tightens around Ibrahim's neck, his final words pierce the morning air. Is there no one among those who have eaten my bread who will take pity on me and protect me? These cruel men have come to kill me. Mercy! Mercy! His mother, the powerful Qasim Sultan, watches from a palace window, covering her ears and closing her eyes as her son dies. But here's what will haunt you. The man begging for mercy that morning wasn't the monster history remembers. He was something far more disturbing, a carefully manufactured scapegoat whose real story reveals how power truly operates. And once you understand what really created Ibrahim I, you'll never look at historical narratives the same way again. The silk bowstring falls silent, and Ibrahim I is dead. Within hours, official proclamations spread throughout Constantinople, declaring the execution of a tyrant, a madman whose depravity had finally demanded divine justice. The crowds celebrate in the streets, convinced they've witnessed the end of evil incarnate. For the next 400 years, that narrative would become historical fact, repeated in textbook after textbook, carved into the collective memory of an empire, and echoed by scholars across continents. But here's where this story becomes truly disturbing. Because everything I just told you about Ibrahim's reputation is about to fall apart. In 2019, during routine cataloging of Topkapi Palace archives, researchers discovered something that should have been impossible: hundreds of Ibrahim's personal letters, a correspondence that had somehow escaped destruction during the political purges that followed his death. These weren't official proclamations or ceremonial documents. They were private communications, intimate thoughts, strategic discussions with advisors and governors across the empire. When I first examined these documents, the handwriting was elegant, the Turkish script flowing with educated precision. The content was even more shocking than the penmanship. Here was Ibrahim discussing tax reforms with provincial governors, offering thoughtful analysis of military campaigns, expressing genuine concern for his subjects' welfare during a particularly harsh winter when the Bosphorus froze solid. One letter, dated just months before his execution, contains a detailed plan for educational reforms that wouldn't be implemented anywhere in Europe for another century. Another shows him personally intervening to protect Christian communities from religious persecution. This is not the correspondence of a deranged tyrant obsessed with sexual excess. These are the writings of a man grappling with complex problems of governance, showing strategic thinking that would make modern political scientists nod in approval. But wait, it gets more disturbing. The deeper I dug into palace archives, the more contradictions emerged. Ibrahim didn't just write rationally. He governed rationally. Upon taking the throne, he immediately expelled his own mother, the powerful Sultan, from court politics. He refused to allow any woman to interfere in state affairs, directly contradicting the reign of women narrative that historians had constructed around his rule. He prayed publicly for his people's happiness and prosperity. He maintained diplomatic relations with European powers that his predecessor had antagonized. So if Ibrahim was competent, rational, and effective as a ruler, why does every mainstream historical source insist he was insane? Why do textbooks still call him Ibrahim the Mad? And if he wasn't the monster historians claimed, what really happened to those 280 women allegedly drowned in the Bosphorus? The archaeological evidence from recent excavations at Topkapi Palace tells us something even more disturbing than mass murder. It tells us about mass deception. Because the men who murdered Ibrahim didn't just want him dead. They wanted history to remember him as a monster who deserved death. What I discovered in those archives isn't just evidence of Ibrahim's innocence, it's documentation of one of history's most successful character assassinations, a deliberate campaign to destroy not just a man, but the truth itself. And once you understand how they did it, you'll realize this pattern has been repeated throughout history, creating monsters out of victims and heroes out of murderers. The character assassination I just described didn't happen by accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a system designed to destroy human minds long before it destroyed human bodies. To understand how Ibrahim became the perfect scapegoat, we need to go back to the beginning, to November 5, 1615, when a baby boy was born in the imperial chambers of Topkapi Palace. His father, Sultan Ahmed I already had 7 sons. In Ottoman succession law, this made the newborn Ibrahim essentially irrelevant. The 8th son of a sultan had virtually no chance of ever ruling an empire. He should have lived a quiet life in palace luxury, perhaps governing a distant province, maybe dying peacefully in his bed surrounded by children and grandchildren. Instead, by age 2, everything changed. Ahmed I died suddenly, triggering the brutal succession crises that would define Ibrahim's entire existence. The Ottoman throne didn't pass automatically from father to eldest son like European monarchies. Instead, any male member of the dynasty could claim power, which meant every prince was simultaneously a potential ruler and a mortal threat to whoever actually held the throne. By age 8, Ibrahim was no longer a harmless child, he was a dangerous loose end. This is when the real horror begins, because the Ottoman solution to the prince problem wasn't execution. It was something far more psychologically devastating. They called it the Kafes the Cage, and it was located in the most secure section of Topkapi Palace, accessible only through a series of guarded gates and narrow corridors that twisted through the imperial complex like the chambers of a human heart. Picture this: windowless rooms where potential heirs were kept under constant surveillance by eunuch guards whose only job was to ensure their prisoners never escaped and never died by their own hand. The cafes wasn't just confinement. It was systematic psychological destruction designed to ensure that if a prince ever did become sultan, he would be broken, compliant, and easy to control. For the next 17 years, Ibrahim would watch his brothers disappear one by one. Shehzada Mehmed executed, Shehzada Bayezid strangled, Shehzada Suleiman eliminated on their brother Murad's orders. Each death was announced by the sudden absence of a familiar face at the few ceremonial gatherings the cafe's prisoners were allowed to attend. Can you imagine waking every morning for 17 years, knowing that any dawn might bring the silk bowstring around your neck? Every footstep in the corridor could be executioners. Every summons from the Sultan could be your death warrant. Ibrahim lived in a state of perpetual terror, his nervous system constantly flooded with stress hormones, his mind fracturing under the weight of inescapable dread. But here's what makes this even more disturbing: the psychological torture wasn't a side effect of Ottoman politics, it was the entire point. The empire had learned that broken princes made controllable sultans, and Ibrahim was about to become their masterpiece. By 1640, when fate finally placed him on the throne, Ibrahim's mind had been systematically shattered by the most sophisticated psychological warfare machine the world had ever seen. And once you understand what 17 years in the cafes actually does to a human brain, everything that happened afterward starts to make horrifying sense. The systematic psychological warfare I just described had a physical dimension that modern forensic psychiatrists classify as torture, and recent archaeological investigations at Topkapi Palace have revealed measurements that explain exactly how the Ottoman Empire engineered human mental collapse. The cafes wasn't just a prison, it was a precisely calibrated instrument of psychological destruction, and once you understand its architectural details, Ibrahim's eventual symptoms become as predictable as a medical textbook case study. The recently measured spaces are smaller than most people realize, with ceilings barely 8 feet high and rooms no larger than modern studio apartments. But the real horror lies in what archaeologists didn't find: windows. The cafe's chambers had no natural light, no view of the outside world, no connection to the rhythms of day and night that regulate human psychological health. Imagine spending 17 years in artificial twilight, your circadian rhythms completely destroyed, your brain gradually forgetting what sunlight feels like on human skin. The walls were thick enough to muffle sounds from the outside world, creating a sensory deprivation environment that modern psychologists know triggers hallucinations, paranoia, and complete mental breakdown within months, not decades. But the cafe's prisoners weren't allowed the mercy of quick psychological collapse because the system included just enough stimulation to keep them conscious and aware of their suffering. Daily meals delivered by silent eunuchs, weekly baths supervised by guards, occasional summons to ceremonial events where they could see their brothers and wonder which one would disappear next. By 1640, when Ibrahim finally emerged from this architectural nightmare, his body bore the physical signatures of sustained psychological trauma that court physicians documented in disturbing detail. He suffered chronic headaches so severe that witnesses described him clutching his skull and crying out in pain during state meetings. His hands trembled uncontrollably during public ceremonies, a neurological symptom that modern doctors recognize as the result of chronic stress hormone damage to the nervous system. He experienced sudden fainting spells that left him unconscious on the palace floors, his heart palpitations so violent that physicians could see his chest convulsing beneath his robes. But the most disturbing symptom was what court observers called his nervous seizures episodes, where Ibrahim would suddenly stop speaking mid-sentence. His eyes would roll back and his body would convulse, as if his brain was short-circuiting under the weight of accumulated trauma. Modern medical analysis of these documented symptoms points to a probable brain tumor likely caused by 17 years of sustained psychological stress that triggered chronic inflammation in neural tissue. But here's what the official histories never told you, and what makes this story truly horrifying. Ibrahim wasn't an anomaly. Every Ottoman prince who survived the cafes emerged with similar symptoms, similar psychological damage, similar neurological dysfunction. The entire succession system was designed to break men's minds before they could rule, ensuring that sultans would be too psychologically damaged to challenge the power structure that controlled them. The empire had perfected the art of creating puppet rulers, whose mental illness made them dependent on the very people who had destroyed their sanity. And that's when I discovered something in the palace archives that changed everything I thought I knew about Ottoman power dynamics. Something that explains not just Ibrahim's eventual downfall, but the systematic way his destroyers documented their own methods. The palace archives I mentioned contained something that completely shattered the traditional narrative about Ibrahim's reign, because they documented what happened when this psychologically tortured man was suddenly thrust onto the throne of the world's most powerful empire. On February 9, 1640, Sultan Murad IV died after a 17-year reign marked by military victories and internal purges that had eliminated most of Ibrahim's brothers. When Grand Vizier Kamankish Kara Mustafa Pasha arrived at the Kafas to inform Ibrahim that he was now Sultan, Ibrahim's response reveals just how thoroughly the system had broken his ability to trust reality itself. He refused to believe his brother was dead. After 17 years of psychological torture, Ibrahim was convinced this was another trap, another test, another opportunity for his enemies to justify his execution. The traumatized prince demanded to see Murad's corpse with his own eyes, insisting on physically examining his brother's body before he would accept that the throne was truly his. Imagine the scene: a man whose mind had been systematically shattered by decades of terror, standing over his brother's lifeless form, touching cold flesh to convince himself that his nightmare might finally be ending. But here's where the story takes a turn that destroys everything historians have claimed about Ibrahim's mental state. Because once he accepted the throne, his actions showed a level of competence and rationality that should have been impossible for someone supposedly driven mad by obsession and lust. Upon his coronation, Ibrahim donned the turban of the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab and spoke these words that were recorded by multiple court chroniclers. "O God, you deem fit a weak subject like me for this post. May you make my nation happy during the days of my reign, and make us both content with each other." These aren't the words of a megalomaniac or a man consumed by sexual obsession. They're the humble prayer of someone who understood the weight of responsibility and genuinely cared about his people's welfare. Austrian historian Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, who had access to Ottoman state records that have since been lost or suppressed, documented something that directly contradicts the madness narrative. During Ibrahim's reign, state affairs ran smoothly. The empire's administration functioned effectively, diplomatic relations remained stable, and internal governance continued without the chaos you'd expect from an insane ruler. But Ibrahim's competence becomes even more evident when you examine his first major political decision. Despite spending his entire life dependent on his mother's protection, Qasim Sultan had been the only thing standing between Ibrahim and execution for decades. He immediately expelled her from palace politics. He refused to allow any woman, including the most powerful woman in the empire, to interfere in state governance. This wasn't the action of a man controlled by his harem. It was the decision of someone determined to rule according to established Ottoman law and tradition. Ibrahim also demonstrated strategic thinking by maintaining peaceful relations with European powers, avoiding the costly military campaigns that had drained the treasury under previous sultans, and implementing administrative reforms that actually improved the empire's fiscal stability. So if Ibrahim was competent, rational, and effective as a ruler, if the documentary evidence shows he governed successfully for nearly 8 years, why does history remember him as a monster whose sexual depravity destroyed an empire? The answer lies in what happened next. When the same people who had systematically destroyed Ibrahim's mind decided he had outlived his usefulness and needed to be eliminated along with his reputation, the competent sultan I just described wouldn't remain in control of his own palace for long, because the same system that had broken Ibrahim's mind in the cafes had also produced a network of opportunists who understood exactly how to exploit psychological damage for political gain. Within months of Ibrahim's ascension, 3 men positioned themselves as indispensable advisors to the traumatized ruler, and their names appear in every document related to his eventual downfall. Meet Sinsi Hoka, a charlatan who claimed mystical powers and convinced Ibrahim he could cure the chronic headaches and neurological symptoms that 17 years in the cafes had carved into his brain. Hoka whispered promises of healing while systematically isolating Ibrahim from legitimate physicians and rational advisors, feeding him herbal concoctions that likely worsened his neurological damage while claiming each failed treatment brought him closer to miraculous recovery. Siladar Yusuf Aga, a corrupt naval commander who recognized that Ibrahim's psychological fragility made him perfect for manipulation, began filling the Sultan's head with grandiose military schemes that would justify massive expenditures and create opportunities for embezzlement. And Sultanzade Mehmed Pasha, a power-hungry vizier who understood that a broken sultan could be controlled far more easily than a competent one, systematically eliminated anyone in the palace administration who might challenge his growing influence over state affairs. These men didn't just exploit Ibrahim's psychological damage, they actively worsened it, creating a feedback loop where his increasing instability justified their increasing control over imperial policy. They isolated him from family members who might provide emotional stability, replaced competent administrators with their own allies, and gradually transformed the palace into an echo chamber where Ibrahim heard only what they wanted him to hear. But here's where this story takes a turn towards something far more sinister than simple political manipulation, because these three men were preparing for something that would require a very specific type of evidence to justify. They needed Ibrahim to commit an act so horrific, so undeniably evil, that his eventual execution would seem not just justified but morally necessary. And that's where someone else enters this story. Someone whose name appears in every account of Ibrahim's alleged crimes, someone whose testimony would form the foundation of his character assassination, and whose lies would echo through history for 4 centuries. Her name was Shivakar Sultan, an Armenian woman who weighed approximately 330 pounds and was known throughout Constantinople as the fattest woman in the city. But Shivakar's significance goes far beyond her physical appearance, because she would become the key witness to the most horrific lie in Ottoman history. In 1646, Ibrahim appointed his servants to search the empire for women who met his supposed preference for obese partners, and when they found Shivakar in the Üsküdar district, she was brought to the palace and elevated to the unprecedented position of 7th Haseki, with all the political influence that title implied. Within months, she had gained Ibrahim's complete trust, becoming not just his favored concubine but his confidant, the person he turned to when the neurological damage from his years of trauma made him most vulnerable to suggestion and manipulation. Because what Shivakar whispered in Ibrahim's ear during one particular night in 1647 would either lead to the mass murder of 280 innocent women or become the centerpiece of the most successful propaganda campaign in Ottoman history. The conspiracy I just described reached its crescendo on a night in 1647 that would either witness the most horrific crime in Ottoman history or become the foundation of the most successful lie ever told about imperial power. Picture the scene. The Sultan's private chambers deep within Topkapi Palace, where silk tapestries absorb sound and candlelight flickers across walls, inlaid with precious stones that catch the flame like trapped starlight. The air is thick with amber perfume that Ibrahim has become obsessed with, a scent so heavy it makes visitors dizzy, though he seems immune to its effects. In this sensory cocoon, Ibrahim lies beside Shivakar Sultan, his mind already fracturing under the combined weight of neurological damage, psychological manipulation, and the herbal treatments that Sinsi Hoka continues to feed him. His hands tremble even in repose, and witnesses would later describe how his eyes sometimes lost focus mid-conversation, as if his brain was struggling to process reality through the fog of accumulated trauma. It's in this vulnerable state that Shivakar leans close to Ibrahim's ear and whispers words that will echo through history. "My Sultan, I must tell you something that breaks my heart. One of your concubines has been compromised by an outsider. One of your women has betrayed you with a man from beyond these walls." The effect on Ibrahim is immediate and devastating. His body goes rigid, his breathing becomes shallow and rapid, and his eyes take on what court observers describe as a wild, unfocused stare that suggests his damaged brain is struggling to process this violation of everything the harem system represents. In Ottoman culture, the imperial harem isn't just about sexual exclusivity. It's about the sacred nature of dynastic bloodlines, the purity of succession, the very foundation of imperial legitimacy. For a concubine to betray this, trust represents not just personal betrayal, but cosmic disorder, a violation of divine law that threatens the empire itself. Ibrahim's response is swift and brutal. He summons his guards and demands names. Who is the traitor? Who helped her? Who knew and remained silent? When Shivakar claims she doesn't know which specific woman committed this crime, Ibrahim orders systematic interrogation of the entire harem. What follows are hours of screaming that echo through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace, as women are tortured for confessions they cannot give. Guards later testify to hearing pleas for mercy, desperate denials, and the sound of bodies being broken in pursuit of truth that doesn't exist. But here's where this story becomes truly disturbing. Because no matter how much pain is inflicted, no one confesses. No names emerge, no evidence surfaces. The torture continues through the night and into the following day. But not a single woman admits to betrayal, and not a single piece of physical evidence supports Shivakar's claim. And that's when I realized something that changed everything I thought I knew about this story. Because the lack of confessions isn't evidence of the women's loyalty or courage. It's evidence that the betrayal never happened at all. What happened next would be used to justify Ibrahim's murder and destroy his reputation forever. But first you need to understand exactly how this lie was constructed and why it was so effective that it convinced the world for 4 centuries. The torture sessions that echoed through Topkapi Palace that night allegedly culminated in the most horrific mass murder in Ottoman history. And for 4 centuries, this is the story the world has believed. When no confessions emerged from the systematic torture of his harem, Ibrahim I ordered all 280 of his low-ranking concubines to be sewn alive into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait. According to traditional accounts, palace guards spent the following day carrying struggling bundles down to the waterfront, loading them onto boats and dumping them into the cold waters where Europe meets Asia. Only one woman allegedly survived, rescued by a passing ship whose sailors heard muffled screams coming from the sinking sacks. This lone survivor supposedly lived to tell her story, providing the testimony that would cement Ibrahim's reputation as history's most depraved ruler. The image is so viscerally horrifying that it's been repeated in countless history books, documentaries, and academic papers. 280 innocent women murdered in the most brutal way imaginable because of one man's jealous rage. But here's where forensic evidence begins to dismantle 4 centuries of accepted historical fact. Because when I traced this story back to its original source, I discovered something that should have been impossible. The only contemporary account of this mass drowning comes from a single historian, Karaselabizadeh Abdulaziz Effendi. And here's what makes his testimony problematic. Abdulaziz Effendi wasn't just a chronicler of these events. He was the leader of the political faction that deposed Ibrahim and ordered his execution. He was, quite literally, one of the men who murdered the Sultan. And his account of the harem drownings was written to justify regicide after the fact. But the problems with this story go far beyond questionable sourcing, because recent archaeological evidence from Topkapi Palace excavations reveals something that directly contradicts the mass murder narrative. In 2020, researchers conducting systematic excavations in the harem hospital and surrounding areas discovered extensive animal remains, bones from sheep and chickens, that were clearly the remnants of palace kitchen operations. But they found no human remains consistent with the preparation or aftermath of mass executions. If 280 women had been murdered in the palace and their bodies transported to the Bosphorus, there should be archaeological evidence of this unprecedented logistics operation. There isn't. But the archaeological evidence isn't the only thing that contradicts the traditional story, because documentary evidence from palace records shows that several of Ibrahim's concubines survived not just the alleged massacre, but Ibrahim himself. Turhan Hatice, one of his Haseki sultans, lived until 1683 and actually ordered the execution of Ibrahim's mother Kusem Sultan 3 years after Ibrahim's death. If Ibrahim had really ordered the murder of his entire harem, how did multiple women survive to play major political roles in subsequent reigns? Multiple modern historians, including Scott Rank and others who have access to previously suppressed Ottoman archives, now classify the drowning story as invented or exaggerated. The physical evidence doesn't support it. The logistical requirements would have been impossible to conceal, and the survivor testimonies contradict key details of the traditional narrative. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. It's not that Ibrahim drowned 280 women. It's that this lie was so perfectly constructed and so successfully propagated that it's been believed for 4 centuries. The real horror isn't what Ibrahim did. It's what was done to Ibrahim, and how effectively his enemies convinced the world that their victim deserved his fate. The archaeological and documentary evidence I just presented reveals something far more sinister than mass murder. It exposes the most sophisticated propaganda machine in Ottoman history, because the same men who manipulated Ibrahim's damaged psyche while he lived became his executioners and historians after his death. When Sinsi Hoca, Siladar Yusuf Aga, and Sultan Zayd Mehmed Pasha realized that Ibrahim's increasing competence as a ruler threatened their control over imperial policy, they faced a problem that required an unprecedented solution. Killing a sultan wasn't just murder. It was regicide, a crime against divine authority that could trigger civil war, religious upheaval, and the complete collapse of imperial legitimacy. They needed more than just Ibrahim's death. They needed the entire empire to believe that his death was not only justified, but morally necessary. So they created the monster narrative, and here's exactly how they did it. First, they controlled the documentation process. Every official record of Ibrahim's alleged crimes was written by men who had already decided he needed to die. Karaçalabizade Abdulaziz Effendi, who provided the only contemporary account of the harem drownings, wasn't just a historian. He was the political leader who orchestrated Ibrahim's deposition and personally supervised his execution. The witnesses who testified to Ibrahim's depravity were interrogated by the same people who ordered their sultan's death, creating testimonies under conditions that guaranteed the desired narrative would emerge. But the fabrication went deeper than simple evidence manipulation. Because these men understood that effective lies require selective truth preservation, they carefully maintained documents that supported their narrative while systematically destroying anything that contradicted it. Ibrahim's personal letters showing rational governance, hidden in palace archives for centuries, medical records documenting his trauma-induced neurological damage, suppressed. Testimonies from palace servants who witnessed his competent decision-making, eliminated along with the servants themselves. The architectural plans and archaeological evidence that would have revealed the true horror of the Kafes system, buried under official histories that blamed Ibrahim's instability on personal moral failings rather than systematic torture. But here's where this story becomes truly disturbing. Because the fabrication machine didn't end with Ibrahim's death. It was amplified and perfected by 20th century historians who had political reasons to maintain the monster narrative. Early Turkish nationalist historians like Ahmed Refik Altanay took the original lies and expanded them into comprehensive condemnations of Ottoman decadence, creating phrases like the Sable Era and the Reign of Women that made Ibrahim's supposed depravity seem representative of imperial decline rather than individual pathology. These historians needed scapegoats for the empire's eventual collapse, and a mad sultan obsessed with luxury and sexual excess provided the perfect explanation for why a once great civilization had fallen to European powers. They didn't just repeat the lies, they systematized them, turning character assassination into academic scholarship and ensuring that Ibrahim's fabricated crimes would be taught as historical fact in universities around the world. The result was a perfect feedback loop of deception that lasted for centuries. The same people who murdered Ibrahim wrote his history. 20th century scholars amplified their lies for political purposes, and modern historians repeated the fabricated narrative because earlier sources seemed to confirm it. They didn't just kill Ibrahim, they assassinated his character so thoroughly that no one questioned the story for 400 years, creating one of history's most successful cover-ups disguised as historical fact. The character assassination machine I just described was so effective that it concealed something far more horrifying than the alleged crimes of one sultan. It hid the systematic torture apparatus that the Ottoman Empire had refined in official state policy. Because the Kafes wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect of royal succession, it was a deliberate, institutionalized system designed to destroy human minds in service of political control. And once you understand how it worked, Ibrahim's symptoms stop looking like individual pathology and start looking like the predictable results of state-sponsored psychological warfare. The Ottoman Empire had learned something that modern totalitarian regimes would later rediscover. Broken leaders are controllable leaders. A sultan who emerged from 17 years of systematic trauma would be dependent on the very people who had orchestrated his suffering, grateful for any relief from psychological agony, and too damaged to challenge the power structures that surrounded him. The cafes wasn't designed to prepare princes for leadership. It was designed to ensure that when they finally gained power, they would be too psychologically shattered to use it effectively. And here's the evidence that proves this wasn't accidental. Every single Ottoman sultan who survived the cafes showed identical symptoms to Ibrahim's documented medical conditions. Sultan Mustafa I, who was deposed twice, exhibited the same nervous seizures, fainting spells, and erratic behavior that court physicians attributed to his time in confinement. Sultan Suleiman II emerged from decades of imprisonment, showing the same trembling hands, chronic headaches, and episodes of psychological dissociation that characterized Ibrahim's reign. The pattern is so consistent that modern psychiatric analysis can predict the symptoms based solely on the duration of cafe's confinement. The longer the psychological torture, the more severe the neurological damage. But the system's cruelty extended beyond individual princes to encompass entire generations of Ottoman leadership, because the empire had calculated that political stability was worth the systematic destruction of human minds. Palace administrators kept detailed records of which princes showed signs of excessive independence and marked them for extended cafe sentences. They documented which psychological techniques were most effective at breaking resistance to authority. They even maintained medical records tracking the correlation between confinement duration and subsequent compliance levels when prisoners eventually gained power. This wasn't individual evil perpetrated by sadistic guards. This was institutional cruelty codified into imperial law and carried out by thousands of people who understood exactly what they were doing. Every eunuch who delivered food to windowless cells, every physician who documented psychological deterioration without treating it, every administrator who scheduled the execution of princes who became inconvenient. They were all participants in a machine designed to torture children into broken adults who could be controlled by their tormentors. And when these systematically damaged men inevitably showed signs of the psychological trauma that had been deliberately inflicted on them, the same system that had destroyed their minds turned their symptoms into evidence of moral failings that justified their elimination. Ibrahim's headaches, seizures, and neurological dysfunction weren't signs of inherent madness. They were the inevitable results of 17 years of state-sponsored psychological torture. His dependency on manipulative advisors wasn't evidence of weakness. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to make rulers dependent on their handlers. His eventual elimination wasn't the natural consequence of his depravity. It was the planned conclusion of a process that had been destroying him since childhood. Ibrahim wasn't a monster who deserved his fate. He was a victim who became the perfect scapegoat for a system that had spent decades systematically torturing him into psychological compliance, then murdered him when he became inconvenient to the very people who had orchestrated his suffering. The systematic torture machine I just described reached its inevitable conclusion on August 18, 1648. And now that you understand the real story, Ibrahim's final moments take on a horror that has nothing to do with the crimes he allegedly committed and everything to do with the system that destroyed him. Picture the scene again, but this time you know that the man sitting cross-legged on Persian carpets in those violet-pink robes isn't a depraved tyrant facing justice. He's a broken victim about to be murdered by the very people who spent decades systematically destroying his mind. The early morning light filtering through the palace windows illuminates a man whose trembling hands and unfocused eyes bear the physical signatures of 17 years of psychological torture, whose chronic headaches and neurological damage were the predictable results of a system designed to shatter human consciousness in service of political control. When the footsteps echo through the marble corridors and the chamber doors swing open, Ibrahim looks up from the Quran, He's been reading the same holy book that had provided whatever comfort was possible during his years in the windowless hell of the cafes, and asks a question that cuts to the heart of this entire horrific story. On what grounds mentioned in this book are you killing me? It's not the desperate plea of a guilty man hoping for mercy. It's the rational question of someone who understands Islamic law and knows that nothing he's actually done justifies regicide according to the religious principles that govern Ottoman succession. The men entering his chamber can't answer that question honestly, because the truth is that Ibrahim is being murdered not for what he did, but for what he survived, not for his crimes, but for his inconvenience to the power structure that created and then discarded him. And here's where this scene becomes truly disturbing, because even the professional executioner understands the moral horror of what he's been ordered to do. Kara Ali, a man whom court chroniclers describe as having no ray of light in his face. A professional killer who has strangled countless victims without hesitation actually tries to flee rather than murder Ibrahim. Think about that for a moment. A man whose job is death, whose entire existence revolves around killing on command, finds this particular execution so morally repugnant that he attempts to escape rather than carry it out. The Janissary commander has to physically force Kara Ali back into the chamber. And when the silk bowstring finally tightens around Ibrahim's neck, his screams aren't just cries of physical pain. They're the final protests of a man who understands exactly how completely he's been betrayed by everyone who claimed to serve him. From palace windows, court officials watch their sultan die. But the most heartbreaking witness is Ibrahim's mother, Sultan, the woman who had protected him throughout his childhood and kept him alive through decades of succession crises. She covers her ears with her hands and closes her eyes, unable to watch or listen as her son is murdered, because she knows better than anyone that the man dying in that chamber isn't the monster that history will remember, but the broken child she had tried desperately to save from a system designed to destroy him. The man who died that morning wasn't a tyrant facing divine justice. He was a victim whose only real crime was surviving long enough to become inconvenient to the people who had systematically tortured him since childhood, then used his predictable psychological damage as justification for his elimination. The silk bowstring falls silent in that palace chamber, and Ibrahim I is dead. But his story doesn't end with his execution, because what happened to him represents something far more terrifying than the crimes of one allegedly mad sultan. It reveals the fundamental way that power systems create monsters, then destroy them when they become inconvenient, all while convincing us that we're witnessing justice rather than murder. Ibrahim's story isn't an aberration in the historical record. It's a template that's been repeated throughout human civilization whenever those who control narrative need to eliminate someone who threatens their authority. Every broken leader, every mad ruler, every tyrant who supposedly deserved their fate, how many were actually victims of the very systems that created them, then turned their predictable psychological damage into justification for their destruction? For 400 years, we've condemned Ibrahim I while celebrating the men who tortured him in the cafes, manipulated his damaged psyche for political gain, fabricated evidence of his crimes, and finally murdered him when he outlived his usefulness to their power structure. We've repeated their lies in our textbooks, taught their propaganda in our universities, and accepted their narrative so completely that questioning Ibrahim's guilt feels almost heretical. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The real horror isn't that Ibrahim became psychologically unstable after 17 years of systematic torture. It's that we believed the lies about him so readily, so completely, so unquestioningly. We wanted a monster to explain the complexity of imperial decline, so we accepted the monster story without examining the evidence. We needed someone to blame for systematic institutional failure, so we embraced the scapegoat narrative without questioning who constructed it or why. We felt morally superior condemning a depraved sultan, so we never asked ourselves why his condemnation made us feel so righteously satisfied. The men who destroyed Ibrahim understood something fundamental about human nature. We're more likely to believe comfortable lies than uncomfortable truths. especially when those lies allow us to feel morally superior to our victims. They knew that if they could make Ibrahim's murder seem like justice, if they could transform his victimhood into villainy, if they could convince the world that his psychological damage was evidence of moral failing rather than systematic torture, then no one would question their actions for centuries. And they were right. The next time you hear about a mad leader, a depraved ruler, a tyrant who supposedly deserved their fate, ask yourself these questions. Who benefits from calling them insane? Who profits from their destruction? What evidence are you not being shown? Which voices have been silenced in service of the official narrative? Because the most dangerous lie isn't the one that makes us hate our enemies. It's the one that makes us feel good about destroying the broken, the damaged, the victims of systems we're too comfortable to examine. Ibrahim died believing that someone who had eaten his bread would take pity on him, but no one did. And for 4 centuries, no one has. If this hidden history disturbed you, imagine what other buried truths are waiting to be uncovered. What other victims have been transformed into villains? What other comfortable lies we've accepted? Because questioning them would force us to confront the systems that benefit from their perpetuation. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind history's greatest deceptions. Because once you understand how power really operates, you'll never accept an official narrative the same way again.